Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to the Humanities class and our unit on the Enlightenment. And what we're going to go through today is the final segment of this unit. Now, if you remember last video, we went through the 1600s and the 1700s. Now we're going to go through the 1800s, where the Enlightenment sort of trails off and then kind of fades into the general modern era, the 1900s, that we're going to spend quite a bit more time on and looking at in more detail, as it's usually something that we're a lot more familiar with as we study world and global history in high school. So we left off last time, if you remember from what our notes were kind of following along with, we left off with these musicians in the 1700s. And kind of following in that aesthetic and artistic focus, what I usually do is I have us then move into the Romantic era, or a little quick discussion of the Romantic era and the Romantic poets during this period. Now, as the notes say here, when we discuss the Romantic era or a Romantic era poet, we are not referring to romance in either the genre sense that you maybe think of, where you think, oh, it's about, people who are in love and couples and, kissy smoochy kind of stuff. That's not what we mean by romantic, nor is it even a reference to the romans that we would see, the romans kind of medieval tales that we would see like in the Arthurian legends, right, of knights and princes and all this kind of stuff. It's not what we're talking about either. The Romantic era refers to this kind of influx of artwork and sort of passionate movement that we see during and a little bit after the Enlightenment. And in a sense, if you want to like kind of look at some general kind of oversimplified cultural trends, the Romantic era is, in some sense, in some small way, a response to the kind of hyper-rationalist sort of expression that we see in the culture of the Enlightenment. So as we have everyone over here being very, rational, very intuitive, very kind of like humanistic, we see sort of a void opening up, or maybe a gap opening up, where we're like, well, wait a minute, what about all of that stuff we discussed in the Renaissance, where we have all of the, the impassioned, sort of exalted view of the arts and of passion and beauty and all this kind of stuff. And that's sort of where the Romantics come in. So as you can see down there, the notes say thus: during this period, there was a movement of artists and culture characterized by, as we're going to see, four major characterizing points, or at least the four things that I teach my students that really identify a piece of artwork or an artist as a Romantic era artist. Let's take a look real quick. The first one is a love of the natural world, right? The Romantic era poets and Romantic era novelists and painters and all these kind of stuff, they loved the aesthetic beauty, the sublime aesthetics of the natural world. So trees, vast landscapes, all this kind of stuff. They adored it, right? So the reason I usually put this, I can't remember the name of it. It's like something wandering above the sea of mists or something like that. It's very famous painting, and you'll see it very frequently if you discuss or look at a book that is associated with the Romantic era at all. It's always on the cover. That identifies so many features of the Romantic era in it, because what is the main thing that really catches your eye? Yes, it's the man in the foreground, but notice his back is to you, right? He's not really meant to be the focus. It's the expanse of the sea of mists and the vast landscapes. So if you see a piece of artwork that is a realist painting, right, is trying to look generally realistic, it's not abstract, it's not really kind of crazy, and it's old in a medieval way, and it's trying to depict a vast landscape where humans are kind of just there to show you the scale of the landscape, that's a Romantic sort of or sort of painting. Okay, so love of the natural world, the beauty in the natural world. Next, they have this intense, passionate, emotional expression behind them. So if you remember back in the music section of the last video, we looked at Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. And I usually tell my students Beethoven is sort of the romantic bridge between that earlier romantic, or that earlier pre-romantic sort of period, and then the movement into the romantics, at least on the side of music. His music was so different than the other two artists that we discussed, that we mentioned there, because of how romantic it was in this sense. It was very passionate in its emotional expression. It was an outpouring of some sort of emotion. And that sort of feature is not solely identified with the Romantic era. Like we see passionate emotional expression in other artworks, but when it's the author trying to pour his or her emotions into a work in a very passionate and expressive way, and that becomes one of the main features of the artwork that you're noticing. Again, this really identifies it as something that is very romantic in its sense. And now we sitting here in the year 2024, we will definitely recognize that as well. That's something that's really normal in our work, isn't it? That's not necessarily was. So it's another one of those cool instances of when we look at history, we see sort of ourselves living in the ripples in the kind of post-romantic era, where a lot of our artwork and our artistic process has been influenced by this feature of this particular movement. Third, we have the interest in religion, right? The Romantics are very interested in the mystical, the transcendent, kind of the mystique around the religious and mystical world. In the spiritual world, especially. So, for instance, as kind of a simple example of that, when you're looking at the Romantic era poets, especially the poets, they are universally deeply, deeply influenced by John Milton. John Milton's Paradise Lost came out, as you saw in the era before this, had an immense influence. It was like a cultural bomb. It was like Star Wars for us. Like it was just huge. Like they all really, really loved it for many different reasons. And so as a result, a lot of their work and a lot of their interests are shaped by that particular poem in different ways, in different forms. Like it's not always going to be, oh, they're going to just write commentaries on Paradise Lost. No, they might just really like the aspect of how we see the passionate expressions in the character of Satan. They might really love the exploration of the romance between Adam and Eve. They might really like the exploration of why does God allow evil in Paradise Lost? Why did God create the devil at all? All that interest in religion can find its way or finds its way into the Romantic era poems and the Romantic era in general. Okay, so this interest in religion, they're not an intensely atheistic sort of movement. They're not a very kind of like hyper rationalist, hyper secular movement at all. They definitely have that aesthetic, if anything, interest in the religious world. And then finally, they have a general emphasis on the internal experience, the intrinsic or intuitive experience of someone, of either a character in their work or themselves as the author. So this kind of, I usually drew an equation for my students in a more advanced setting. I would draw an equation between this move where we see the Romantics really leaning into what is going on in the internal world, the emotional world, the mental world, the psychological, spiritual world of either the author or the narrator. And you kind of see the same thing again, in a much, much lesser sense, back during the Renaissance, when we were discussing works like Shakespeare and even John Milton again. We had characters delivering these very rich and complex soliloquies and these really kind of focused or character studies almost, at least relative to those time periods. And then we see kind of that continue and deepen actually in the Romantic era. So these four features are usually what I tell my students to keep in mind, right? You have the love of the natural world, emotional expression, passionate emotional expression rather, an interest in religion, so some presence of religious subject matter or something like religious subject matter, and then the emphasis on some sort of internal experience, okay? These really characterize the Romantic era as a whole, all right, as a whole group of art and an era in history. Now, like we said, very influenced by John Milton, all this kind of stuff. Now, we have for you, if you're following along with our notes and our assignments here, we have three poems rather, that I'm going to ask you to analyze in some depth. The first poem is, I believe it's, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by William Wordsworth, or Daffodils. I can't remember the exact title of it, but the Daffodil poem by William Wordsworth. Really lovely, very beautiful, very lyrical poem. Then we have Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley, right? A very famous one for those of us who watched Breaking Bad, right? They recite this there. Those of us who watched Alien Covenant, they recited it there as well. It's a really ominous, very, very beloved, kind of dim and dark sort of poem there. And then we also have The Tiger by William Blake, probably one of the most iconic Romantic era poems in general, right? The Tiger. So for these three poems, Again, I'm not going to read them through in detail and answer the questions for you here, because we have in 9th grade and in 10th grade, we actually go through, if not one, then we go through all of these poems in those courses. So if you want an in-depth look at those, go check out those courses instead. But for here, what we want you to do is, number one, for all 3 of the poems, I want you to identify where do you see those 4 features that we just discussed, because they're all there, right? All 3 of those poems use all 4 elements of the Romantic era and to basically help you identify that they are, in fact, Romantic era poems. So find those for us. And then number 2, it's differing for each poem. But for the first poem, I want you to summarize the poem in your own words. What is the narrator actually doing? And it's difficult for the Daffodil poem, because what you're essentially following and what you're listening to is the narrator's own internal experience. It's all basically kind of within his head, so in his emotional world. What is he doing, basically, all right? What's going on there? And then for number 3, what is the poem essentially expressing, therefore? What emotion, what feeling, what experience, or what thought is William Wordsworth expressing there, therefore, okay? And for that poem in particular, I would recommend that you not think too deeply about it, okay? A lot of us really struggle with poetic analysis because we think that it's always going to be some really deep and really, really abstract and really crazy, riddle-ish sort of meaning behind it. Not always, guys and gals. Very rarely, I would say, it's meant to be that way. So, especially for this one, don't overthink it too much. Okay, take it for what it is. Let it express itself to you, and let the meaning of it and the feeling and the sensations of that poem wash themselves over you. And then just tell us in simple terms what's going on here. And then for Ozymandias, a little bit more simply, but tell us, what is the poem, it's a short one, trying to communicate through its imagery and its illusions, okay? Little bit more complicated, all right? This particular poem, I think, is a little bit more difficult, along the lines of what I just told you that Wordsworth's poem is not like. This one is a little bit more of a code breaker. You need to kind of figure out, what is Percy Bysshe Shelley describing in this poem? What is it that we're looking at, right? Where he's describing a scene, and in that scene, something's going on, and we are meant to kind of have some sort of feeling about this scene. It's supposed to affect us in some way, shape, or form. And that is what we need to figure out here, okay? And yes, there is an allusion in this particular story. Now, the direct allusion is not terribly important. Simply to understand who Ozymandias is relative to what his statue looks like now is kind of helpful. It does have some kind of thematic link and support if you're able to figure it out. But I will just tell you that, take a look at the allusion. It might help trigger a little bit of an understanding of what's going on in this poem for you. And then finally, for the tiger, number 2 is asking you to simply identify, what question does this poem really seem to be posing? Because there are many questions. You go look at the tiger, and there's a bajillion different, question marks. But I think William Blake is really posing for us one simple question. And I'll give you a hint. It's something that we have asked in this course before, and we actually asked it in our religion unit. So William Blake is asking the same question within his wonderful poem, The Tiger. So what is this question exactly? Identify that. And then number 3, what illusion do you see in this poem? So again, actually, the illusions that are being made in that poem are, or that poem is making allusions to 2 works that we have actually looked at before in this particular course, okay? Some in the religion unit, some in the Renaissance unit. So go take a look at that poem and see if you can figure out what the illusions are, all right? And that's all you got to do for poetry. Okay, so that's the Romantic era. Very simplified, very kind of skimmed over, but, there you go. Now, once we finish discussing, the music and the poetry, I like to shift back into the 1800s and shift back into our kind of discussion of philosophy and innovations that are going on during the Enlightenment, and continue our discussion on not just, as you see, slavery, but also about this guy named Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin comes on the scene at the later part of the Enlightenment. And what's going on about him? Let's read the quick summary of his stuff. He became famous for his discovery of natural changes in species. This gave rise to the theories, well, notice this, plural, of evolution, which essentially claims that there is a progressive evolution of species based on natural selection, okay? So Darwin comes on the scene, he's observing the biological changes and features of species, and he sees that there are likely changes through these species based on what seems to be most adaptive and most likely to produce effective offspring for species. And he sees this in the natural world, and he kind of surmises, okay, well, that probably extends to human beings, right? We probably evolved through almost countless, natural changes based on what would produce the best results for us through evolution throughout the centuries. Okay, so he does this, and what are the implications? What are the repercussions that happen? As it says here, some believed that this theory was in conflict with religious theories as an explanation of the origin of life. This and other scientific innovations partly resulted in the emergence of American fundamentalism, which believed that the Bible must be interpreted literally and not questioned at all. Okay, so that's Charles Darwin, real quick. Now, a couple things here before we get into the slavery issue. I want to talk about Darwin with you. What is the issue with Darwin generally? I think the issue is he comes on the wake of what already were some general cultural conflicts between religious institutions and more secular institutions. In what way? We talked about how during the Enlightenment, you had, and even during the Renaissance to some degree, you had some tension starting to emerge between the church authorities and the authorities of the secular world, of kings and queens, of scientists, and all this kind of stuff. We talked about Galileo and Copernicus and all this kind of stuff. So we saw the kind of beginnings of some discomforting relationships between religion and science there. Well, on the heels of all that, on the heels of more and more philosophers of the Enlightenment saying that they wanted to be more secular, they wanted to water down religion, they wanted to kind of, stop its influence over society so much, or at least on themselves. We then have Charles Darwin come out and say, well, it looks like human beings and all species generally came about through natural selection and kind of evolution throughout the ages. Why was this a problem? Because some people interpreted that, as the first paragraph describes, some people interpreted Darwin's theories as, number one, an explanation for the origin of life, and number two, as essentially as a kind of competing story for human anthropology or human theology, right? So in terms of the origin of life thing, that kind of fits in. They both kind of are the same thing. They're kind of flip coins, or two sides of the same coin in that sense. But essentially what you see is this idea that, oh, well, now we have a secular, a kind of atheistic at the very most story as to how we got here. So religion used to have the role in society of explaining, here's the origin of the world, here's therefore its meaning that lies behind it all. And Darwin kind of gave some secularists and a lot of atheists this new notion of like, well, wait a minute, no, we weren't necessarily created by, intricate design by an all-powerful being. It was actually more of just kind of a gradual natural process that we came about, and we're just here as a result of all that. There's nothing especially unique, therefore, about the humans being the humans being the kind of result of a designer now. Okay, so a couple things now. Did Darwin actually push this in his writings or in his own theories? Did he express secular atheism distinctly in his work? Not really, no. Okay, he was very kind of simplistic in the sense that he focused entirely on his finches, right? His discussion of this theory of evolution. He wasn't necessarily out to attack the church at all or attack religion at all. And here is where we have to make the distinction based on what we were discussing all the way back in the medieval era, and even a little bit in the religion discussion, which is there actually logically any inherent contradiction between Charles Darwin's theories and the beliefs of the Judeo-Christian religion here? Well, it depends, essentially. It depends, like we talked about with Genesis, on your reading of Genesis. Do you read Genesis as a literal scientific text that is telling you how the world came to be? If you do read it that way, if you do choose to read it that way, then yes, there is a clear conflict between that and the theories which are espoused by Charles Darwin and then are really supported and backed up by a lot of other scientists following him. Okay. So that's a problem, right? That's an issue. However, if you do not read Genesis literally, if you think Genesis is meant to be read more as at least some form of poetry or mythic kind of expression of some kind of religious truth, then there is no necessary contradiction between the theories of evolution and Christianity. And a lot of people kind of took that as just what it was. They were like, okay, yeah, like the Eastern Orthodox Church was like, okay, whatever. The Catholic Church was like, okay, whatever. Like, sure, that was their positions. However, when you see the American religious groups, you have as a result what is called the Great Awakening in the American South, especially where a lot of different Protestant groups were reacting negatively to this because they saw what I discussed earlier, which was this kind of reemergence and this kind of forceful presence of a secular sort of spirit or a secular sort of mood in the culture. And as a result, these particular religious groups felt more and more threatened or more and more concerned, if you want to call it that, for the kind of spiritual health of the culture. And as a result of then Darwin coming on the scene and then Darwin's theories starting to emerge and spread, they started to react more and more aggressively. And they would say, no, like we are going to be fundamentalists now. We're not going to question the Bible at all. We're not going to make any kind of, complex, nuanced looks at the Bible in this sense. We're not going to get into those debates. We're going to say, look, it's text. It says what it says. That's what it was. Our scientific understanding needs to be subject to what the Bible says, essentially. So they put the Bible as the main source of scientific and spiritual knowledge, and they put discoveries of natural science below that. So they need to essentially conform themselves to the Bible. Now, it's worth saying, and the reason I like pointing this out is because, again, for our religious discussion, that's a really big keystone as to how people understand religion nowadays. As I said earlier, most religious denominations, minus a lot of Protestant ones, do not read Genesis literally at all, guys and gals. The Jews, the Christians, even the Muslims don't, as a majority, read it literally. They read it as something that is metaphorical. They read it as something that is mythic. True in the deep sense, yes, in the deep spiritual sense, absolutely. And giving you very important insights into those particular religions, but not meant to be read as a scientific text. Whereas a lot of the denominations, particularly, the Baptists, definitely read this, and the fundamentalists, of course, definitely read this as something that is meant to be taken literally. And thus we have a new spark in the, debate essentially between science and religion. So that's an interesting cultural point that emerges at this particular time. However, here's the issue. And again, this discussion of religion and science is going to kind of have another leg into this discussion too. Slavery continues to become a major issue in the American system into the 1800s. Okay, so take a look at what this paragraph says. The emergence of evolutionary theories also helped fuel racist ideas in the Western world after the first Civil War in America. So it's a fun little kind of cultural tit for tat here. We see that the emergence of these theories of evolution, the emergence of sciences, did have a negative effect on the hyper kind of religious groups, right? That made them, become more and more fundamentalist and kind of closed off in a lot of sense to the scientific innovations of the time. But then you also see that a lot of people actually took Darwin's ideas and sort of created this weird, like we talked about last time, this weird fusion of those theories into anthropological societal ideas, in the sense where they would just simply say some humans are more evolved than others and therefore they are almost subhuman, right? It's pretty grotesque. It's pretty kind of wicked if you want to look at it that way. Yeah, it really is. Where you say, this person, for whatever weird kind of theory we're going to put forward based on Darwinian evolution in some sense. This group of people is therefore less human than we are. They are less evolved. Based on what? Based on the skull shape, based on their civilization, based on whatever, kind of ad hoc, out of left field, arbitrary means that they're going to discuss this. Yeah, whatever. So this was a major cultural thing in the 1800s. I remember one of my history teachers back in high school actually had a copy of an 1800s, I think it was an 1870s textbook. I think it was from down south in America. I don't know where it was specifically, but it literally would break people down that way by the races. It would say like, oh yeah, the Italians are a little bit less enlightened, but they're this. The Japanese are a little like way down there, and then the Jews and all this kind of stuff. And it was like, it was just literally kind of marking us on an evolutionary scale based on our race and our ethnicity. So yes, the Darwinian theories definitely did play into, or at least provide some fuel for these racist ideas. However, is it worth saying once again, did Darwin push that? No, he didn't, any more than anyone at that time would have inherently had those kind of normal for that time racist ideas. But no, it was just another thing that people grabbed and then used as a weapon for this. And this kind of, again, it fuels more and more of the debate around slavery in the American system. So you have this weird battle happening, essentially, in the culture of America, where some people are really hardcore abolitionists. They're like, no, slavery is evil, slavery is wrong, we got to get it out of here. Well, what did they use to support that? Their major tool to do that was religion. They would say, look, if you look at the Bible, if you read it consistently, it's very clear to us that slavery is wrong. And that's basically what they would say. That was their argument. And they would say, also, just look at it. Just look at what it's doing to people. Look at these people, have experience about them. Look at that they are, in fact, people, and we shouldn't be doing this. Okay. Versus, you would also have people on the other side of the aisle who wanted to keep slavery in its place, mostly because of economic means. That was making them a lot of money at the time, right? So they were like, no, keep it, otherwise our business, our lifestyle are going to go, bottom up. So they would claim that, but then they would also use, again, kind of try to use the Bible to advocate for this and say, oh no, if they in fact are, lesser people, they are, the children of Cain, and all this kind of stuff. And it became very clear, to be frank, that those arguments from a clearly analytical perspective, ladies and gentlemen, we're very weak, right? It's extremely difficult. You have to do like logical Olympics to try to argue that slavery is okay. The type of slavery that you were seeing, especially in the 1800s, that this was okay based on what the Bible was saying. That's a very, shaky, very, very shaky at best sort of arguments. It's a much stronger movement on the abolitionist side that was fueled by religious ideas. Okay, and this, by the way, is a typical feature of early American literature. This was one of my specialties when I did my undergraduate research in American literature. The area that I looked to focus on was the literature of both slaves, Black people, and also the Native Americans, and also women, and basically the minority groups, kind of the more oppressed groups of the time. And one feature that became very clear, that was a very typical move of those groups, was that they would take the quote unquote religion of their oppressors, the religion of Christianity, and they would actually read it and then use it in order to argue against their oppressors and say, this religion actually advocates for us to be treated better. So that you had Native Americans, converting to Christianity, and then kind of, preaching these beautiful sermons saying like, look, like Jesus and the apostles and the saints in these texts really clearly would not be okay with what you're doing to us. And then Blacks would do the exact same thing. So all of this begins to ferment what you saw coming at the very drafting of the Declaration of Independence. You saw the conflict over slavery in that document. That's why we talked about Jefferson's first draft there. The seeds of that conflict were right there in this nation's creation. And so then it finally becomes an issue. It finally just reaches a point where we cannot reach a conclusion, or we cannot reach any sort of good deal about this. And you have the Civil War, the American Civil War breakout in the 1860s. Over what, as it says here, with long-standing issue on the right to own slaves, and it finally ends in the defeat of the Southern separatist states, the U.S. Confederates, and the abolition of slavery in the USA. So after this long, bloody war, which I believe kills over 600,000 Americans, we finally do have the nation held together, first of all. So the Civil War does not result in a separatist nation. It actually results in the Union defeating the separatists in the South, and then actually passing the abolition of slavery. So slavery is abolished in America. Okay, so a couple things now. A passage for your notes on Thaddeus Stevens, okay? So I like to use Thaddeus Stevens because for a couple different reasons. First and foremost, Thaddeus Stevens is a wonderful speaker. He really identifies, or kind of identifies the nature of speaking and writing in this particular period in the American government. He's a very passionate abolitionist, and he wanted a lot more than just all slaves to be freed. He wanted to, seize land from the Federates and the separatists and all this kind of stuff and give them to the slaves. So he was very, very, very passionate man when it comes to slaves' rights. And I wanted to read this particular passage from him just to give you a little bit of insight into the spirit behind the abolitionist movement. Thaddeus Stevens writes, "From my earliest youth, I was taught to read the Declaration of Independence and to revere its sublime principles. As I advanced in life and became somewhat enabled to consult the writings of the great men of antiquity, I found in all their works, which have survived the ravages of time and come down to the present generation, one unanimous denunciation of tyranny and of slavery, and eulogy of liberty." So number one is asking what here? What are his views on the U.S. Constitution? That it has sublime principles, okay? That the principles enshrined in the Constitution, the rights, and all this sort of stuff are sublime. So he loves the U.S. Constitution. He thinks it is amazing. And what are his views on slavery? Okay. And what movement do you suspect he was a part of? Well, I've told you that part. So let's just look at his views on slavery. So he says, Homer, the Greek tragedians, Cicero, Hesiod, Virgil, Tacitus, and Sallust, in immortal language, all denounced slavery as a thing which took away half the man and degraded human beings, and sang paeans in the noblest strains to the goddess of liberty. Okay, so he's basically saying that, not only in the Declaration of Independence and the traditions that it draws on, but even in the traditions of the ancient world, okay, the Greeks and the Romans all have some sort of negative view on slavery, right? They don't hold it up as something good or something righteous. They're just saying it's something negative. Now, by the way, we can actually kind of fight against Thaddeus on that point. I think he's being a little bit biased there. I think some of those authors would have at least some nuanced views on slavery, right? So, but generally, he's kind of got a point there that, yeah, we do in fact see that phrase, by the way, takes away half the dignity of a man. We see that right in Homer when Odysseus is discussing, talking about slaves, or talking about the slavery that's happening. What was it? Not in his house. It was one of his men discussing the nature of slavery and the nature of why people are not working in his house when he returns home. So yeah, Thaddeus is very well read here. He's kind of throwing a little bit of a reference to Homer directly there. Now, he says all this, sure. And we then get this last sentence. "And my hatred of this infernal institution and my love of liberty were further strengthened and inflamed as I saw the inspired teachings of Socrates and the divine inspirations of Jesus." Okay, so yes, I have in the Declaration of Independence, but then I got older and I was able to read all the ancient Greeks and classics, and I saw some negative views on slavery there, absolutely. But then I had the huge strengthening of my views on slavery when I read Socrates and the divine inspirations of Jesus, right? So he uses Jesus as his kind of final point here to condemn slavery. Now, what are his views on slavery? Hatred, okay? He hates it. And he calls it an infernal institution, okay? Referencing, as you can see, the term inferno, the infierno. It is damnable. It is satanic. It is evil, right? So in no short terms, Thaddeus Stevens is an abolitionist through and through. Okay, so number three, where does Stevens draw inspiration of his views on slavery? What might this make sense given your knowledge of history? Okay, we talked about this last time. Why is it that we see so much anti-slavery movement and power and inspiration coming from religious sources or religious traditions? We understand this, guys and gals, because a lot of the values that emitted or that were emitted and came from Christianity became so infused into the culture of the Western world that it was inevitable that something like this was going to happen. So if you are being a consistent Judeo-Christian, religious practitioner and really reading the text closely and trying to enact its policies and its values into society, you are probably going to enact something like an anti-slavery law. It's just going to happen, right? You're not going to allow this to continue to happen. That is a deeply Judeo-Christian idea. It just is. Okay. Now, moving forward from this, and by the way, it's worth saying, of course, just to prepare ourselves for the 1900s, does the abolition of slavery remove racism and all the other problems for the Black community in America? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. All right. The segregation still continues. The intense racism of that particular era still continues into the 1900s, and it's going to reach a peak in the 1960s, as we will see in the next unit. But just know it's not gone, right? Slavery is gone, yes, but all the other kind of problems of societal, hatred and resentment, those are all still there. Okay, so the next piece of artwork. Notice we're kind of hopping back and forth between art, history, philosophy. It's all rambled in there in a typical humanities fashion. The next thing to cover, which we're not going to do in any deep depth here because I'll discuss why in a minute, is novels, right? The novels are becoming a new hyper kind of fascinating and hyper popular form of artwork in the 1800s, right? In the Enlightenment period. So novels. What is a novel, right? It's technically a narrative prose work that lasts generally, over 250, maybe like 300 pages long, generally speaking. Now, is this the first time we see novels? Absolutely not. But what we're going to do in this particular section of the course is look at 4 novels based on what you want to look at, okay? So what am I doing here? I am telling you simply that it is now your job to select one of these novels and to therefore go out and fill out a research graph, as I'm going to pose it for you here, and then kind of report it back in class or report it back to me for one of our assignments for this particular course. So you'll notice, by the way, as this course continues or has continued, especially in these last 2 units, the research level kind of goes up and my general kind of going through the information for you goes down. So that's why I usually save these particular units for a little bit after 9th grade, because it's a little bit more research based, as things tend to be the more higher up you go in grades. So what are you going to do? You're going to pick Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, Charles Dickens, or Fyodor Dostoevsky, and you're going to report back on one of their famous novels. So let's take a look real quick. How are we going to do this? So you're going to pick, for example, from Mary Shelley, what famous novel did she write? The one that we're going to talk about in this particular course, the one I want you to talk about, is Frankenstein. Okay, she wrote what is probably the greatest romantic novel out there. The Romantic era novel of Frankenstein is like pinnacle of the Romantic era. It just is. It's beautiful. It's amazing. So you're going to tell me, for any of these works, by the way, you're going to tell me what is the general summary of the story. So give me, like, in 3, 4, 5 bullet points, what are the main things that happen in the story? Spoilers included, all that kind of stuff. What is the style and genre? We know that it is a novel, sure, but like, how is it organized? What point of view is it told from? Is there any weird kind of features of the structure? All this kind of stuff. I'll tell you right now, there is a very different structure for all of them, right? They do not all follow the same structure. There are some very new ways of writing stories that these guys employ. And then finally, identify for me some of the main themes. Probably I would shoot for 3. I always like 3 themes. What are some 3 general ideas or topics that Shelley is trying to explore in her work? Okay. And then finally, give me the most famous passage or quote, or the most meaningful quote. Of course, you can go look on like, a whole collection of quotes and passages from Frankenstein online, but find one that you think really encapsulates not only the themes, but also kind of the structure and the general tone and the mood of the story, right? And post that here for us, okay? So you're going to follow that same sequence of instructions based on what I just told you for the other three guys or gals here, all right? Now, let me tell you what the other novels are before we move on. So do that for Frankenstein. Then we're going to do one for Bram Stoker. Now, what did Bram Stoker write? What is he? Let's look at his little description here. Yeah, he's the greatest Gothic novelist. He wrote Dracula. All right, I want you to research Dracula for him. So, what is Dracula? If you don't know what Dracula is, like, oh my gosh, what's going on? It is a novel about a vampire, okay? The vampire Dracula and his journey to from where he lived, Transylvania. Oh my God, from Transylvania to London. Tell me the same things that we were looking for in Frankenstein, but about Dracula. Okay, very similar, by the way, very similar in its structure. You'll see why. Now, for Charles Dickens, who is Charles Dickens? Charles Dickens is the greatest English novelist out there. Right? He wrote the greatest English novels. Period, right? He's just the best-selling author. He's one of the best-selling author, I think the best-selling author of all time. His novels are still being, sold and read. And his most famous one that I want you to discuss here is A Tale of Two Cities, which I think is one of, if not the most, the best-selling novels of all time, right? Give me the same information you did for the other two about A Tale of Two Cities. Okay, and now we come to Fyodor Dostoevsky. We got a Russian guy now, and he is, as it says, the greatest Russian or the Russian epic novelist, right? The greatest epic novelist. All right. So, what is an epic novel, by the way? It's a novel that's really freaking long. It's very long in its structure. It's got parts, it's got chapters, it's got sequences, it's got books in it, right? Books within books. Typical epic stuff. What did Fyodor Dostoevsky write that I want you to look at? I want you to look at the novel Crime and Punishment. Okay, so go through Crime and Punishment, go through A Tale of Two Cities, go through Dracula, go through Frankenstein, and where is a good way, or what is a good way to research these? Because I highly doubt that my students have the time or have the resources to read all four of those novels for this course. It's not what we're doing. Okay, just like the other texts, we're not reading them in full. We're doing research on them. We're reading some passages, all this kind of stuff. What do I want you to do for these four? I would particularly like you to use the website Lit Charts, which I will provide a link for in the description of this video. So Lit Charts is a great one because it was very clearly made by English nerds. Okay, English nerds made that one. People who like English literature made those summaries, and it's really, really beautiful way of just kind of getting the gist of a text for this particular assignment. Now, by the way, am I encouraging you to cheat, therefore, and use this particular site for your reading and kind of pass off the idea that you read your homework and just read this website? No, of course not. Do I think that you should use this website for class as a supporting material? 100%. If you are struggling with a particular text, or if you're struggling to understand a particular thing that your teacher has assigned you, or something that you're reading just for your own sake, absolutely use this as a resource. Guys and gals, I use YouTube videos, I use articles, I use lit charts, I use everything at my disposal to help bolster my own comprehension of a particular work. And I also try to use my own, mind and my own kind of an analytics to do it as well. Take as much aid as you can get. Don't pass it off as like, your original idea, right? That's just kind of lame. That's you just lying and, plagiarizing in some form. But use it, essentially. Use the wisdom of the past ages who have looked at these things in more depth than you or I have, and use it to your advantage, okay? But for this particular class, we're not looking to read the whole of these particular four novels. If I had a longer class, I would assign you to read one of them at least for a longer assignment. But for now, again, we're just getting a skim through of the humanities. Give us this basic information on those novels. Okay, finally, to end the 1800s, we have two philosophers that are going to give us a preview as to what is going to come in the 1900s. As most of you probably will know, the 1900s was characterized by a lot of violence and a lot of upheaval in many different forms. And I like to end the 1800s with these two philosophers, with these two guys who essentially foreshadow what is going to come. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at the claims, the essential claims of these particular philosophers. And then I want you to respond to them in some way. How do you respond to these philosophical claims? Well, you could, number one, you could agree with them. You could say, like, I intuitively just agree with this. I think that this is right. I think this is great. Explain why, right? Give me some good explanation as to what your response is, why you like it. You could be confused. You could say, I don't fully understand it. And that's still a response. Tell me, what do you mean? Like, what is it that is not clear, right? What would you like clarified about these particular claims that these guys are making? What could they help you understand more? You could, if you don't want to just agree, if you don't want to have just deeper questions and not totally understand it, you could also just flatly say, I don't know if I agree or disagree. Like, I understand what they're saying, but I'm not really sure if it's true or false. I'm not really sure if it's a valid or an invalid claim that they're kind of making or they're putting forward. I'm not sure if I totally agree or disagree with their philosophy. That's fine. Or, guys and gals, you could just straight up disagree. You could say, no, I don't agree with this. I think that this is wrong, and here's why, okay? So provide us with some, appropriate length of your appropriate length response for these claims that were being made here. Okay, who's first? Mr. Karl Marx. What is Karl Marx's essential claim? Number one, all human suffering is the result of economic and class inequality. That's claim number one, right? So our suffering is a result of how we are unequal. We are struggling against inequality between human groups, okay? The upper versus lower class, generally, right? The bourgeoisie and the proletariat, as he would say. So that's his first claim. Agree, disagree, want clarification? You tell me, okay? But look at it closely. He's saying all human suffering is a result of economic and class inequalities, okay? So think about that for a little while. A lot of people will agree with that and say, yes, of course, it makes sense. I mean, like, most of our issues would be solved if we could get more money and we wouldn't have to struggle against, an upper class, essentially. A lot of people will say, no, I disagree with this because there are many, many deeper problems that are not rooted in inequality and in economic reasons. So enjoy that debate back and forth. The next claim that Karl Marx has is that capitalism prevents humans from the full potential of happiness. Okay, so capitalism kind of keeps us oppressed. We are not able to be as happy and as productive and what do you want to call it? Like, not really productive, but like we are not able to be as happy and fulfilled as we could be in a capitalist system. Well, what is capitalism, by the way? If you don't know what capitalism is, it is essentially an economic philosophy, an economic model that says we should be allowed to compete for more money and work for more money in an open market kind of way. If we want to essentially start a business, we should be allowed to start a business, but we should also be allowed to compete against other businesses that are trying to do the same thing. And then we have sort of a Darwinian effect, right? Where the best business, whoever does it the best, will win out. Marx says this is bad because it causes us to fight against each other. It kind of engenders this sort of ruthless, anti-human, discompassionate behavior within people, and it will not allow, it will not spread happiness as much as it could be spread, okay? And then his next claim is that capitalism, therefore, must be overthrown to usher in a communal ownership of an economic justice. So if we get rid of that system, we could create a system where we essentially act as a communist system, where we have all people working to help each other and everyone getting just as much as they need and working for just as much as they are able to work, and therefore kind of passing things around where we get rid of the need for any sort of real monetary value or any real monetary competition, and we live in a commune together, right? That is his, perfect scenario, perfect world. So we can work towards this, and we can all just kind of support each other, essentially. Okay, so that's Karl Marx. You tell me, you agree with him? You disagree with him? Why? You're not sure about what he says? Okay, what do you need more clarification on? You're not sure about it? Okay, that's fine. Tell us what you're not totally sure of. Tell me why you're sort of on the fence. What are the arguments that you're struggling with on both sides? Okay, that's Karl Marx. Next, we have Friedrich Nietzsche. So, what is Nietzsche's first claim? Number one, The ideas of human equality and Christian morality stifle our full potential to self-actualization. So, self-actualization, that is our full, psychological, personal, physical, emotional potential, is stifled by two things. Christianity, or Christian morality, as he sees it there in that particular culture, and these ideas of human equality, right? That everyone's equal, we all need to act, and treat everyone equally, all this kind of stuff. Nietzsche says, no, you need to try to be the best you can be. And you are not equal to others necessarily. You can try to be better than others. You can try to be stronger and greater than others. And these notions of Christian morality that try to get you to be meek and help the poor and look well on the weak and the meek and all these other kind of groups, no, they make you weak, essentially. They make you, stifled in your potential. They are slave moralities, as he will say. Okay, that's the first claim of Friedrich Nietzsche. You agree with him, disagree with him. You say, nah, yeah, Nietzsche's got something going for him. I feel a little bit stifled, under Christian morality. We should be a little bit more assertive and self-expressive and self-actualized. Or is he totally wrong? If he said, no, this is awful, you should absolutely kind of embrace as much, compassion, as much, aid to the poor, and you should exalt the people who are weak and all this kind of stuff. That's what you're going to basically be debating with that Nietzschean claim. The second one, all of life is a will to power that we should work towards, okay? You're trying to get more and more power and more self-actualization. You're trying to empower yourself more and more and more. All of your drives, all of your desires, all of your actions, all of your behavior in life stems from that point. You are trying to gain more power, and you should try to become as grand and as self-actualized as you could possibly be. That's the second claim. Final one, quote unquote, God is dead, and we must usher in a new era of humanity, of human creativity and achievement. So, but what he means by God is dead is not, I literally went and stabbed God. No, he means that this whole Christian culture that we've been living in since before the medieval era. So Nietzsche recognizes what we've been talking about in this course, which is that, yes, our culture in the Western world here for the past several hundred years has essentially been a Christian culture. It has been a Christian soiled culture, like the soil of the ground. And it has been growing out of that Christian soil. So whatever we have in society, our values, even as he says, our understanding of what is right and wrong, is all colored and all comes from Christianity. Notice, even if you're a secularist, even if you are not a religious person, even if you're an atheist, he says simply by being in this culture, the values that you have gotten from this culture make you essentially a Christian because they're Christian values. Nietzsche says, well, no more. God is dead, based on all of the secularization that's been happening, based on the kind of power of science and innovation and human ingenuity. So scientific, humanistic naturalism and secularism has made us has brought us to the point where God has no real, and religion, I should say, has no real power in society anymore, no real power over our lives, and should not. We should get rid of it, essentially. And therefore, we must create a new way of understanding human achievement and creativity. We should find a new religion, right? A new kind of Ubermenchian religion, the Superman, right? Our will to power should bring us forward. So that's Nietzsche, okay? You tell me, do you agree with him? You think he's got a point? Do you think, are you kind of in the middle on Nietzsche? And that, by the way, is the other option that I did not give you guys, which is, do you agree with parts of their claims, but not entirely? Do you think that they got something going there, but you're not totally in agreement with them, right? Are you going to assent to some points that they're saying, or give them, some grounds in what they're saying, but not totally give them the whole field? You tell me, okay? I'd be really impressed if you can sort of sense where we're going, all right? Sense why these two boys are the foreshadowing figures of the 20th century, okay, of the 1900s that we're about to look at, all right? So do that, give me the responses. That will be the end of the Enlightenment era. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. And the next time I see you, we will talk about the 1900s. Thanks very much.